You've been accused of witchcraft. The year is 1580, and you're living in a small village somewhere in the Holy Roman Empire. The harvest has failed for the second year running. 3 children have died of fever, and the local miller's wife gave birth to a stillborn child just last week. The villagers are looking for someone to blame, and all eyes have turned to you. Maybe it's because you live alone at the edge of the village. Maybe it's because you know which herbs can ease a headache or calm a crying baby. Maybe it's simply because your neighbor covets your small plot of land and sees an opportunity. Whatever the reason, the whispers have started. And in medieval Europe, whispers about witchcraft have a way of becoming death sentences. Tonight we're diving deep into one of history's darkest chapters to answer a terrifying question. Could you actually survive a witch trial in the Middle Ages? By the end of this video, after we walk through the horrifying reality of medieval witch persecution, you'll understand why the answer for most people was a resounding no. We'll explore the twisted logic behind the trials, the impossible tests that determined guilt or innocence, and the systematic torture that broke even the strongest spirits. But first, let me set the stage properly, because the witch trials weren't some brief medieval madness that lasted a few years. We're talking about a systematic campaign of persecution that stretched across 3 centuries and claimed between 40 and 60,000 lives. From roughly 1400 to 1775, over 100,000 people were prosecuted for witchcraft across Europe and British America. These weren't random acts of mob violence. They were legal proceedings, complete with judges, evidence, and carefully documented confessions extracted through methods that would make modern interrogators sick. The peak of this madness occurred between 1560 and 1630, during a period when Europe was already tearing itself apart through religious wars and political upheaval. The Counter-Reformation was in full swing. The Protestant and Catholic churches were locked in deadly competition for souls, and everyone was looking for enemies within their own communities. Into this toxic atmosphere came the perfect scapegoat, the witch. Now, before we go any further, I want to be crystal clear about something. Everything I'm about to tell you is historically documented. These aren't Hollywood fantasies or folklore. These are real legal procedures that real people endured in real courtrooms across medieval and early modern Europe. The methods I'll describe were used thousands of times, recorded in official documents, and justified by the most learned men of their age. So who exactly was at risk? The demographics of witch trial victims reveal a disturbing pattern that tells us everything we need to know about medieval society's power structures. Roughly 80% of those convicted were women, and most of them were over 40 years old. But it wasn't just any women. It was the most vulnerable women in society. Widows who had inherited property, unmarried women who lived independently, women who practiced folk medicine or midwifery, women who were simply too old, too poor, or too outspoken for their community's comfort. Think about Anna, a typical victim whose story was documented in detail. She was a single woman over 40, poor, and she had made the fatal mistake of having an affair with her employer. When she threatened to reveal the relationship, he found a convenient solution: a witch accusation. Under torture, Anna confessed to crimes she had never committed, and she was executed by decapitation. It was only revealed much later that the entire accusation had been a calculated move to silence an inconvenient woman. This wasn't an isolated case. Time and again, we see accusations of witchcraft being used to remove inconvenient people, settle property disputes, or eliminate potential rivals. Women who challenged social norms, who accumulated too much independence, or who simply knew too much about the wrong people, found themselves facing the terrible machinery of witch persecution. But the trials didn't just target women randomly. They followed predictable patterns based on medieval beliefs about supernatural evil and feminine weakness. The church taught that women were more susceptible to demonic influence because of their supposedly weaker spiritual nature. Older women were considered particularly dangerous because medieval medicine believed that menopause made them more prone to supernatural corruption. Poor women were suspect because desperation might drive them to make pacts with the devil for worldly gain. The actual process of accusation could begin in dozens of different ways. Sometimes it started with simple gossip. A cow died unexpectedly, a child fell ill, a thunderstorm destroyed a harvest, and suddenly people were looking for supernatural explanations. Who had been seen near the cow before it died? Who had argued with the child's mother? Who might harbour grudges against the farmers? In other cases, the accusations were more calculating. Property disputes, inheritance conflicts, and personal vendettas could all be resolved through a well-timed witch accusation. The beauty of witchcraft charges, from an accuser's perspective, was that they were almost impossible to disprove. How do you prove you haven't made a pact with the devil? How do you demonstrate that you haven't cast spells in secret? The burden of proof was effectively reversed, requiring the accused to prove their innocence rather than forcing accusers to prove guilt. Once an accusation gained momentum, it took on a life of its own. Medieval communities were small, tight-knit places where everyone knew everyone else's business. When whispers started circulating about witchcraft, they spread like wildfire. Neighbours remembered strange incidents from years past, reinterpreting innocent events as evidence of supernatural malice. That time, you muttered angrily after an argument suddenly became evidence that you had cursed someone. The fact that you kept cats or grew unusual herbs became proof of your connection to dark forces. The theological framework supporting witch persecution was sophisticated and deeply embedded in medieval Christian thought. Church authorities had spent centuries developing elaborate theories about how witches operated, what powers they possessed, and how they could be identified. The infamous Malleus Maleficarum, or Hammer of Witches, published in 1487, provided detailed instructions for identifying, prosecuting, and executing witches. This book wasn't some fringe text. It was widely distributed, officially endorsed, and treated as the definitive guide to witch hunting. According to these authorities, witches gained their power by making explicit pacts with Satan, trading their souls for the ability to harm their neighbours through supernatural means. They could supposedly cause illness in humans and animals, destroy crops, control weather, and even fly through the air to attend midnight gatherings called witches' Sabbaths. These beliefs weren't considered superstition by medieval standards. They were accepted theological fact, supported by biblical passages and scholarly commentary. The legal framework surrounding witchcraft prosecution varied significantly across different regions of Europe, but certain patterns emerged everywhere. In some areas, witch trials were handled by church courts operating under canon law. In others, secular authorities took charge, applying local criminal codes that had been modified to address supernatural crimes. The Holy Roman Empire, where some of the worst persecutions occurred, had a particularly complex system where local princes and bishops competed for jurisdiction over witch cases. What made these legal proceedings so deadly was their departure from normal judicial safeguards. Traditional criminal trials required multiple witnesses, physical evidence, and adherence to established procedures that protected the accused. Witchcraft trials operated under special rules that made conviction almost inevitable. Testimony from a single witness might be sufficient for prosecution. Confessions extracted under torture were treated as reliable evidence. Even the accused's own family members could be compelled to testify against them. The economic incentives driving witch persecution cannot be ignored. Successful prosecution of a witch typically resulted in the confiscation of their property, which was then divided between the court, the local authorities, and sometimes the accusers themselves. This created a powerful financial motive for pursuing witch cases, especially when the accused possessed valuable land, livestock, or other assets. Professional witch hunters like Matthew Hopkins, known as the Witchfinder General, made lucrative careers out of traveling from town to town, offering their services to identify and prosecute witches. Hopkins alone was responsible for the execution of over 300 alleged witches in England during the 1640s, charging substantial fees for his expertise. The costs of imprisonment, torture, and execution were often charged to the accused's family or estate, creating a perverse system where victims literally paid for their own persecution. The Bamberg witch trials provide a perfect example of how economic incentives could drive systematic persecution. The Prince Bishop who orchestrated these trials made enormous profits by seizing the lands of those he condemned, continuing his campaign until he had accumulated substantial wealth and power. A special building, known as the Witch House, was constructed in 1627, specifically to handle the massive volume of accused witches being processed through his courts. This brings us to the heart of our question. Given this system of accusation, prosecution, and execution, what would it actually take to survive a witch trial in medieval Europe? The answer depends entirely on understanding the specific tests and procedures used to determine guilt or innocence. Because these weren't arbitrary punishments, they were supposedly scientific methods for detecting supernatural evil. The most famous of these procedures was the swimming test, also known as the water ordeal. This test was based on the theological principle that water, having been blessed in the sacrament of baptism, would reject anyone who had renounced their Christian faith through a pact with Satan. The logic was elegantly simple and absolutely deadly. If you were innocent, the holy water would accept you and you would sink. If you were guilty, the water would reject you and you would float. The actual procedure was meticulously documented and brutally implemented. The accused would be stripped to their undergarments, bound with their right thumb tied to their left big toe and vice versa, secured with ropes, and thrown into a deep stream or pond. This binding technique was specifically designed to prevent any swimming movements, making survival purely a matter of body density and lung capacity, rather than skill or strength. The test created an impossible situation that perfectly encapsulated the deadly logic of witch persecution. If you sank, you were innocent, but you would likely drown before anyone could pull you back to the surface. The rope tied around your waist was supposed to allow for rescue, but in practice, accidental drownings were common. If you floated, you had just proven your guilt as a witch and would face immediate execution. There was no winning outcome. What made this test even more insidious was its public nature. Crowds of thousands would gather to witness the swimming, treating it like a festival or entertainment. Collections were often held to cover the expenses of the spectacle. These gatherings served multiple purposes beyond mere curiosity. They reinforced community bonds through shared participation in what was seen as divine justice. They provided a warning to anyone else who might be tempted by witchcraft, and they offered a form of cathartic release for communities struggling with crop failures, disease, and economic hardship. The swimming test had ancient origins, evolving from earlier trial by ordeal practices that dated back to the 9th century. Originally known as the ordeal of cold water, or judicium aquae frigidae, these tests operated on the principle of judicium dei, the judgment of God. The underlying theology held that God would directly intervene in the proceedings to reveal truth, making the outcome a divine verdict rather than a human judgment. Royal endorsement gave the swimming test official legitimacy that encouraged its widespread adoption. King James I of England, writing in his Demonology in 1597, provided theological justification for the practice. He argued that God had appointed water to refuse witches because they had rejected the sacred water of baptism through their pacts with Satan. This royal approval meant that local authorities could employ the method with confidence, knowing they had support from the highest levels of government. But even supporters of the method began to recognize its fundamental contradictions. The case of Dorko Boda in Hungary illustrates both the test's use and its ultimate meaninglessness. In 1710, Boda was subjected to the swimming test as evidence against her. When she floated, this was taken as proof of her guilt. She was subsequently beaten and burned at the stake as a witch. Her story demonstrates that the water ordeal was merely the beginning of a victim's suffering, not a definitive judgment that could save them from further persecution. The prayer test represented another common method for identifying witches, based on the belief that supernatural evil corrupted one's ability to speak holy words. Medieval theology held that witches were incapable of reciting scripture accurately, so accused sorcerers were forced to recite selections from the Bible, usually the Lord's Prayer, without making any mistakes or omissions. Any errors, no matter how minor, were viewed as proof that the speaker was in league with the devil. This test revealed the intersection of literacy, class, and religious knowledge in medieval society. Many accused individuals were illiterate peasants who had never learned to read the Bible themselves. Their knowledge of prayers came from hearing them recited during Mass, often in Latin, a language they didn't understand. Under the extreme stress of a life or death situation, even those who knew the prayers perfectly were likely to stumble over words or skip phrases due to nervousness and fear. The case of Jane Wenham in 1712 shows how the prayer test could condemn someone based on the smallest errors. Wenham, one of the last people tried for witchcraft in England, reportedly struggled to speak the words, "Forgive us our trespasses and lead us not into temptation" during her interrogation. The irony was palpable, a woman supposedly struggling with words about forgiveness and temptation while facing false accusations and potential execution for crimes she had never committed. Even more revealing was what happened when someone passed the prayer test successfully. During the Salem witch trials in colonial America, the accused minister George Burroughs flawlessly recited the Lord's Prayer from the gallows just before his execution. Rather than taking this as evidence of his innocence, the authorities dismissed it as demonic trickery. This case perfectly illustrates how witch hunters could interpret any evidence of innocence as proof of supernatural deception, making the tests essentially meaningless exercises in predetermined condemnation. The search for devil's marks and witches' teats represented perhaps the most invasive and humiliating aspect of witch identification procedures. Accused individuals would be stripped naked and subjected to minute examination of their entire bodies, searching for any physical imperfection that could be interpreted as evidence of a demonic pact. The devil's mark was supposedly an unsightly blemish that witches received upon making their agreement with Satan. It could allegedly change shape and color, and was believed to be completely numb and insensitive to pain. Prosecutors also searched for the so-called witch's teat, an extra nipple that was supposedly used to suckle the witch's familiar spirits or helper animals. In both cases, even the most minor physical imperfections could be labeled as supernatural evidence. Moles, birthmarks, scars, warts, or any unusual skin features became proof of demonic alliance. The public nature of these examinations added layers of sexual humiliation and community shame to an already traumatic judicial process. When obvious marks couldn't be found, authorities escalated to the pricking test, which elevated the search for devil's marks to levels of systematic torture disguised as investigation. Professional prickers used specially designed needles to repeatedly stab and pierce the accused person's flesh until they discovered a spot that produced the desired results. According to the theory, true devil's marks would be insensitive to pain and wouldn't bleed, so examiners would continue pricking until they found such a location. In England and Scotland, this torture was eventually performed by well-paid professional prickers, many of whom were actually con men who used dulled needle points to create fake insensitive areas. The institutionalization of pricking as a specialized profession shows how witch hunting became a lucrative industry, with experts developing techniques that guaranteed findings and justified their substantial fees while satisfying clients' expectations of guilt. The touch test exploited beliefs about supernatural connections between witches and their alleged victims, creating yet another impossible scenario for the accused. This test operated on the idea that victims of sorcery would have a special reaction to physical contact with their tormentor. In cases where someone fell into fits or convulsions, the suspected witch would be brought into the room and forced to lay hands on them. If the victim's condition improved upon contact, this was interpreted as proof that the suspect had caused the original affliction through supernatural means. The famous case of Rose Cullender and Amy Denny, two elderly English women charged with bewitching young girls, demonstrates how the touch test worked in practice. The children had been suffering from fits that left their fists clenched so tightly that strong men could not pry their fingers apart. However, whenever Cullender or Denny touched them, their hands immediately relaxed and opened. Rather than considering natural explanations for this response, the court took it as definitive proof of witchcraft. The touch test's reliance on potentially coached or psychosomatic responses from alleged victims made it particularly susceptible to manipulation. Children, who were often the supposed victims in witch cases, could be influenced by adult expectations or unconscious cues about how they were supposed to react. The test also put accused witches in another double-bind situation, where both positive and negative outcomes could be interpreted as evidence of guilt, depending on the predispositions of the authorities conducting the examination. But these tests, horrifying as they were, paled in comparison to the systematic torture used to extract confessions from those who failed to prove their innocence through the preliminary examinations. The methods employed were carefully designed to inflict maximum psychological and physical suffering, while leaving the victim alive enough to provide detailed confessions that could implicate others in the supposed conspiracy. Waterboarding, though we associate it with modern interrogation techniques, was commonly used against accused witches. Victims were tied to planks or chairs and repeatedly dunked headfirst into water, pulled out just before drowning, then submerged again. Often, pieces of fruit or cloth plugs were placed in their mouths and noses beforehand, preventing them from taking full breaths before being dunked. The methodical nature of repeated near-drowning created lasting psychological trauma, even in those who survived the ordeal. The strappado represented perhaps the most widely used torture device during witch trials. This mechanically simple but devastatingly effective tool was first introduced in the Tower of London in 1420 and quickly spread across Europe. The victims' hands were tied behind their back, and they were hoisted by a rope attached to their wrists, then suddenly dropped and stopped just before hitting the ground. This violent jerking motion dislocated shoulders, tore muscles, and caused permanent nerve damage. The beauty of the strappado from the torturer's perspective was its precise controllability. Pain levels could be calibrated through the height of drops, duration of suspension, and addition of weights to the victim's feet. This allowed interrogators to gradually increase suffering until they achieved the desired psychological impact. The case of religious reformer Anne Askew, condemned for heresy in 1546, illustrates the strappado's devastating effects. Her experience on the rack left her completely immobile, requiring her to be carried by chair to the stake where she was burned alive at Smithfield. The rack, introduced specifically for stretching victims beyond human endurance, represented the pinnacle of medieval torture technology. Victims were tied to wooden structures as cranks tightened ropes that restrained their limbs, systematically stretching them until joints separated and muscles tore. The torture often left survivors permanently unable to walk, creating a horrific bargaining process where body parts served as currency in exchange for desired confessions. Psychological torture accompanied these physical methods, often proving even more effective at breaking resistance. Victims were kept in solitary confinement for months before formal torture began, weakening their resolve through isolation, sleep deprivation, and starvation. The anticipation of pain frequently proved more devastating than the actual infliction of torture, as prisoners' imaginations filled with horrific possibilities based on rumors and witnessed executions. The combination of psychological and physical suffering was carefully orchestrated to achieve maximum compliance. Medieval interrogators understood that breaking the spirit was often more effective than breaking the body, though they employed both methods systematically. This dual approach helped maintain the fiction that confessions were voluntary rather than coerced, allowing authorities to present torture-induced admissions as legitimate evidence in legal proceedings. The economic machinery driving these persecutions created powerful incentives for prolonged and extensive witch hunts. Property seizure was a crucial component of the system, as successful prosecutions resulted in confiscation of the accused's possessions, land, livestock, and other assets. The prince-bishop who orchestrated the infamous Bamberg witch trials accumulated enormous wealth through these seizures, continuing his campaign until he had built a substantial personal fortune from the systematic destruction of hundreds of lives. Professional witch hunters transformed persecution into a profitable business enterprise. Matthew Hopkins, the self-styled witchfinder general, charged substantial fees for his services while travelling from town to town throughout England during the 1640s. His systematic methodology combined multiple testing procedures with psychological manipulation, creating an assembly line approach to witch identification that guaranteed results for his clients while maximizing his own profits. The costs of imprisonment, torture, and execution were typically charged to the accused's family or estate, creating a perverse system where victims literally financed their own persecution. This economic structure meant that witch trials became self-sustaining enterprises that generated revenue for courts, officials, torturers, executioners, and various specialists involved in the process. The more extensive the persecution, the more profitable it became for everyone involved except the victims themselves. The systematic nature of these prosecutions created cascading waves of accusations that could consume entire communities. Under torture, victims didn't just confess to their own supposed crimes. They named accomplices, fellow witches who had allegedly attended midnight Sabbaths or participated in malevolent magic. The Bamberg witch trials perfectly illustrate this terrifying domino effect. Torture could be used without restriction, and each broken victim provided investigators with fresh lists of suspects to pursue. The accused confessed under agony to participating in witches' Sabbaths, engaging in sexual intercourse with Satan and his minions, and casting spells that destroyed crops and killed livestock. But more importantly for the authorities, they named names. Dozens of names, hundreds of names. Each confession created a new web of accusations that expanded exponentially, turning neighbor against neighbor and family member against family member. This wasn't accidental. The system was designed to be self-perpetuating. Professional torturers understood exactly how to extract the maximum number of new accusations from each victim. They would begin with leading questions about known community members, gradually building pressure until the tortured individual would say anything to make the pain stop. The result was a nightmarish spiral where each successful prosecution generated material for dozens more. The special building constructed in Bamberg in 1627, known simply as the Witch House, stands as a monument to the industrial scale these persecutions could reach. This wasn't a courthouse or a prison. It was a processing facility designed specifically for handling the massive volume of accused witches flowing through the system. The very existence of such a structure tells us everything we need to know about how routine and systematic these proceedings had become. Inside the witch house, torture methods included thumbscrews that slowly crushed finger bones, leg vises that gradually compressed limbs until they shattered, and of course the strappado. But the psychological atmosphere was equally devastating. The building itself was designed to terrify, with holding cells where victims could hear the screams of those being tortured in adjacent rooms. The waiting was often worse than the actual pain, as prisoners' imaginations ran wild with anticipation of what was coming. The legal framework that allowed such systematic brutality varied across different regions, but certain patterns emerged everywhere. In areas where educated, professionally trained judges oversaw proceedings, there was somewhat more skepticism about witch trial methods. These justices of the assize generally opposed tests like swimming, understanding their arbitrary and dangerous nature. But in county courts, run by justices of the peace, local gentry with no formal legal training, almost any evidence was accepted as valid. This created a dangerous two-tiered system, where your chances of survival often depended entirely on which type of court handled your case. If you were unlucky enough to face prosecution in a rural area dominated by local officials with limited education and strong superstitious beliefs, your prospects were grim. These authorities were far more likely to accept testimony from witnesses claiming to have seen you flying through the air or conversing with the devil. The absence of standardized legal procedures made witch trials particularly deadly. Traditional criminal proceedings required multiple independent witnesses, physical evidence, and adherence to established rules of evidence. Witchcraft cases operated under special exceptions that made conviction almost inevitable. A single witness might be sufficient for prosecution. Hearsay evidence was routinely accepted. Even the testimony of children, normally inadmissible in court, could be used to condemn an adult to death. Perhaps most devastatingly, the normal presumption of innocence was effectively reversed in witchcraft cases. Instead of prosecutors having to prove guilt beyond reasonable doubt, the accused were required to prove their innocence, an almost impossible task when dealing with supernatural accusations. How do you provide evidence that you haven't made a secret pact with Satan? How do you demonstrate that you haven't cast spells when no one was watching? The very nature of the charges made defense extremely difficult. The role of confessions in this system cannot be overstated. Under medieval legal theory, confession was considered the queen of proofs, more reliable than any other form of evidence. This gave torturers enormous power, because a confession extracted under duress was treated as voluntary testimony that definitively established guilt. The fact that these admissions were obtained through systematic brutality was either ignored or justified as necessary to overcome the supernatural resistance that witches supposedly possessed. The content of these forced confessions reveals the elaborate mythology that had developed around witchcraft by the late medieval period. Victims were compelled to admit attending nocturnal gatherings where they worshipped Satan, received instructions for harming their neighbors, and engaged in various forms of ritualistic debauchery. They confessed to flying through the air on broomsticks or transformed into animals, meeting with demons who appeared in the form of cats, goats, or handsome men. These confessions weren't random fabrications. Torturers used leading questions based on established theological works like the Malleus Maleficarum to ensure that admissions conformed to accepted theories about how witchcraft operated. This created a feedback loop where torture-induced confessions seemed to confirm scholarly theories about witchcraft, which in turn justified more torture and more prosecutions. The sexual elements of these forced confessions deserve particular attention because they reveal the deep anxieties about female sexuality that drove much of the persecution. Women were compelled to admit having sexual relations with Satan himself, describing these encounters in graphic detail that satisfied both the prurient interests of male interrogators and theological theories about how demonic pacts were sealed. The focus on sexual transgression reinforced existing prejudices about women's supposed moral weakness and susceptibility to temptation. Children often played crucial roles as witnesses in witch trials, their testimony carrying special weight because of assumptions about their innocence and inability to lie convincingly about supernatural matters. The cases of Rose Cullender and Amy Denny illustrate how children's behavior could condemn adults to death. The young accusers claimed to vomit pins and needles, fall into convulsions at the sight of the accused women, and suffer various mysterious ailments that physicians couldn't explain through natural causes. These child witnesses were often coached, had already decided on either consciously or unconsciously by adults who the guilt of the accused, leading questions, repeated suggestions, and the intense attention that came with being at the center of a witch trial could easily influence young minds to produce the testimony that authorities wanted to hear. The children themselves may have genuinely believed their own accounts, making their testimony seem all the more convincing to medieval juries. The phenomenon of mass accusations involving multiple children occurred repeatedly across Europe. In these cases, groups of young people would simultaneously begin experiencing fits, claiming to see spectres of local women tormenting them, and naming specific individuals as their supernatural persecutors. These group episodes spread like contagious hysteria, with symptoms and accusations jumping from child to child until entire communities became convinced they were under coordinated supernatural attack. The Salem witch trials in colonial Massachusetts provide the most famous example of how child testimony could spiral completely out of control, but similar patterns appeared throughout Europe. Once children began making accusations, adults felt compelled to take them seriously, leading to investigations that inevitably uncovered more evidence of witchcraft through the very process of looking for it. The tragedy was that these episodes often began with genuine medical or psychological problems that were misinterpreted through the lens of supernatural belief. Seasonal patterns in witch accusations reveal how closely these persecutions were tied to community stress and economic hardship. Accusations typically peaked during times of crisis, failed harvests, disease outbreaks, or severe weather that threatened community survival. When crops withered in the fields or livestock died mysteriously, people desperately needed explanations and someone to blame for their misfortunes. The timing of accusations also followed predictable social rhythms. Many cases began during the long winter months when communities were confined together in close quarters. Minor disputes could escalate into major conflicts, and food shortages made everyone irritable and suspicious. Spring brought its own dangers as communities assessed damage from the winter and began planning for planting season. If prospects looked grim, the search for supernatural scapegoats intensified. Religious calendar events also influenced the timing of witch accusations and trials. The period leading up to Easter, with its emphasis on spiritual purification and the struggle between good and evil, often saw increased attention to signs of diabolic influence in communities. Similarly, harvest festivals and other seasonal celebrations that brought communities together could become occasions for settling scores through witchcraft accusations. The geographic spread of witch persecution reveals fascinating patterns about how ideas and methods travelled across medieval Europe. Certain regions became notorious for particularly intense campaigns of persecution, while others remained relatively untouched by witch-hunting fever. The Holy Roman Empire, with its fragmented political structure and competing religious authorities, saw some of the worst excesses. France experienced significant persecution, but with more variation between different regions. England had fewer executions overall, but developed some of the most systematic methods for identifying witches. Border regions where different legal systems met often became hotspots for witch persecution, as accused individuals might flee from one jurisdiction only to find themselves facing similar or worse treatment in neighbouring territories. The lack of standardised legal procedures meant that someone who might receive a fair hearing in one area could face almost certain execution just a few miles away under a different court system. Trade routes also played a role in spreading both witch-hunting techniques and accusations themselves. Professional witch hunters like Matthew Hopkins travelled extensively, bringing their methods and theories to new communities. Books describing witch identification procedures were distributed along the same commercial networks that carried other goods, ensuring that successful techniques developed in one area quickly spread to others. The role of religious authorities in witch persecution varied significantly between Catholic and Protestant regions, but both traditions contributed to the theoretical framework that justified systematic persecution. Catholic areas often saw church courts taking the lead in witch prosecutions, with trained inquisitors applying centuries of experience gained from hunting heretics. Protestant regions typically relied more heavily on secular authorities, but with strong input from clergy who had their own theological reasons for believing in the reality of witchcraft. The Counter-Reformation intensified Catholic persecution of witches as part of a broader campaign to purify the Church and eliminate all forms of heretical belief. Protestant areas experienced their own waves of persecution as reforming clergy sought to establish their authority and demonstrate their commitment to biblical Christianity. Both traditions could cite scriptural passages supporting the reality of witchcraft and the necessity of executing witches. Individual religious figures played crucial roles in either promoting or restraining witch persecution in their areas. Some bishops and pastors became enthusiastic witch hunters, seeing persecution as a religious duty. Others expressed skepticism about accusations and worked to protect the innocent from false charges. The personal beliefs and attitudes of local religious leaders could literally mean the difference between life and death for accused individuals. The training and education of religious authorities also influenced their approach to witch accusations. Clergy with university educations and exposure to scholarly theological works were more likely to follow established procedures and show some skepticism about the most extreme claims. Local priests and ministers with minimal formal training were often more susceptible to popular superstitions and more willing to accept almost any evidence of supernatural activity. Medical knowledge, or the lack thereof, played a crucial role in generating and sustaining witch accusations. Medieval physicians had limited understanding of mental illness, epilepsy, ergot poisoning, and other conditions that could produce symptoms easily attributed to supernatural causes. When children had seizures, adults experienced hallucinations, or entire communities suffered from mysterious illnesses, witchcraft provided a convenient explanation that seemed to make sense within the existing worldview. The intersection of folk medicine and witchcraft accusations created particular dangers for women who served their communities as healers, midwives, and herbalists. These women possessed knowledge about medicinal plants, childbirth procedures, and traditional remedies that could easily be reinterpreted as evidence of supernatural knowledge. A successful healing could be attributed to beneficial magic, while a failed treatment might be seen as evidence of malevolent witchcraft. Epidemic diseases created especially fertile ground for witch accusations. When plague, typhus, or other contagious diseases swept through communities, people desperately sought explanations for why some individuals survived while others perished. The random nature of disease transmission seemed to suggest supernatural intervention, and communities often concluded that witches were selectively targeting certain victims while protecting others. The symptoms of ergot poisoning, caused by consuming grain infected with a hallucinogenic fungus, may have contributed to some of the most dramatic witch accusation episodes. Ergot could cause convulsions, hallucinations, and bizarre behavior that medieval people interpreted as evidence of demonic possession or supernatural attack. Entire communities consuming contaminated grain could experience mass hallucinations that seemed to confirm the reality of witches and their malevolent activities. Pregnancy and childbirth created particular vulnerabilities for both mothers and midwives when things went wrong. Infant mortality rates were extraordinarily high in medieval Europe, and stillbirths, birth defects, or maternal deaths during delivery were often attributed to supernatural interference. Midwives who attended difficult births could find themselves accused of witchcraft if outcomes were poor, creating a terrible irony where the women most dedicated to helping their communities became targets for persecution. The phenomenon of witch familiars, supernatural helper spirits that allegedly assisted witches in their malevolent activities, created another avenue for accusations based on perfectly normal interactions with animals. Cats, dogs, birds, and other creatures that showed unusual attachment to suspected individuals could be interpreted as demonic familiars. The medieval belief that witches could shapeshift into animal form meant that any unusual animal behavior might be attributed to supernatural causes, domestic animals played particularly important roles in witch accusations because their health and behavior directly affected community welfare. When cows stopped giving milk, horses became lame, or chickens stopped laying eggs, communities looked for supernatural explanations. A woman who had recently argued with the animal's owner might find herself accused of casting spells to harm valuable livestock, especially if she was already viewed with suspicion for other reasons. The economic impact of witch trials extended far beyond the direct costs of prosecution and the seizure of condemned individuals' property. Communities that experienced intensive witch hunting often suffered long-term social and economic disruption as fear and suspicion poisoned relationships between neighbours. Trade and commerce could decline when merchants and craftspeople became afraid to travel or conduct business in areas known for witch persecution. Agricultural productivity sometimes suffered in regions experiencing witch hunts, as farmers became reluctant to adopt new techniques or crops that might be interpreted as evidence of supernatural knowledge. Innovation and experimentation, essential for improving yields and adapting to changing conditions, became dangerous activities that could attract accusations of witchcraft. This created a vicious cycle where communities most in need of improved prosperity were least able to achieve it. The demographic impact of witch persecution was particularly severe in some regions, where the systematic execution of older women disrupted traditional patterns of knowledge transmission. Elderly women served as repositories of community memory, traditional skills, and cultural practices. Their elimination through witch hunting could leave communities bereft of crucial knowledge about everything from medicinal plants to traditional crafts. Labour shortages could develop in areas where witch persecution became particularly intense, as the constant threat of accusation caused some individuals to flee to safer regions. The most skilled and knowledgeable community members were often the most vulnerable to accusations, since their expertise could be interpreted as evidence of supernatural assistance. The loss of these individuals impoverished communities both economically and culturally. The psychological trauma inflicted by witch trials extended far beyond the immediate victims to affect entire communities for generations. Children who witnessed the torture and execution of neighbours, friends, and family members carried these memories throughout their lives. The atmosphere of suspicion and fear that accompanied witch hunts created lasting damage to social trust and community cohesion. Survivors of witch trials, those fortunate few who managed to escape conviction, often found their lives permanently altered by the experience. Even if they avoided execution, they might face ongoing suspicion, social ostracism, and economic boycotts that made normal life impossible. Many were forced to abandon their homes and communities, starting over elsewhere under assumed identities, to escape their reputations as suspected witches. The families of executed witches faced their own forms of persecution and social death. Children of condemned witches were often viewed with suspicion, assumed to have inherited their parents' supernatural corruption. They might be denied marriage opportunities, apprenticeships, or other forms of social advancement that required community acceptance. The stigma could persist for multiple generations, creating hereditary outcasts within medieval society. But perhaps the most insidious aspect of the witch trial system was how it trained entire populations to view their neighbours with suspicion and to interpret ordinary misfortunes as evidence of supernatural malevolence. Communities that experienced witch hunts became fundamentally altered, their social fabric rewoven with threads of fear and distrust that could persist long after the immediate persecution ended. The gradual decline of witch trials occurred through a combination of legal reforms, educational advances, and changing intellectual attitudes that made the arbitrary nature of witch hunting procedures increasingly obvious to authorities. Educated judges began to recognize the unreliability of torture-induced confessions and the logical contradictions inherent in tests like swimming and pricking. Legal scholars published critiques of witch trial procedures that highlighted their departure from established principles of justice. The influence of the scientific revolution and Enlightenment thinking gradually undermined the theological framework that had supported witch persecution. As educated elites developed more sophisticated understanding of natural phenomena, they became less willing to attribute unexplained events to supernatural causes. Medical advances provided alternative explanations for symptoms that had previously been interpreted as evidence of witchcraft or demonic possession. Economic factors also contributed to the decline of witch hunting. As European societies became more commercially oriented and legally sophisticated, the arbitrary seizure of property through witch trials began to seem counterproductive to economic development. Merchants and other commercial interests recognized that the climate of fear and unpredictability created by witch hunts was bad for business. The last official executions for witchcraft in various European countries occurred at different times, reflecting the uneven pace of legal and intellectual reform. England saw its final witch executions in 1716, when Mary Hicks and her daughter Elizabeth were hanged. Scotland's last execution occurred in 1727 with Janet Horne. The Witchcraft Act of 1735 formally ended traditional witchcraft prosecutions in Britain, though it continued to criminalise pretending to practice magic, treating it as fraud rather than supernatural crime. But even after official witch trials ended, informal persecution continued in many areas, as deeply ingrained beliefs about witchcraft proved resistant to legal and intellectual change. Vigilante violence against suspected witches occurred sporadically throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, with documented cases like Anna Clemens in Denmark in 1800, Christina Sejnowa in Poland in 1836, and the mysterious figure known as Dummy, the Witch of Sybil Hedingham in England in 1863. These later incidents demonstrate how official legal changes didn't immediately alter popular attitudes toward witchcraft and supernatural threats. Communities continued to take justice into their own hands when they believed traditional authorities had failed to protect them from supernatural danger. The persistence of these beliefs well into the modern era shows how deeply witch-hunting mentalities had penetrated European consciousness during the centuries of systematic persecution. So now we return to our original question. Could you have survived a witch trial in medieval Europe? After examining the systematic nature of these prosecutions, the impossible tests used to determine guilt, the torture methods designed to extract confessions, and the economic incentives driving continued persecution, the answer becomes clear. For most people, survival was not a matter of innocence or guilt, but of pure chance, social connections, and the specific circumstances of their particular case. The fortunate few who escaped conviction typically possessed one or more crucial advantages that set them apart from the masses of victims. Wealth could buy better legal representation, influence key officials, or provide resources for escape to safer jurisdictions. High social status offered some protection, as authorities were more reluctant to accuse prominent community members without overwhelming evidence. Geographic location mattered enormously, as some regions had more skeptical judges or stronger legal traditions that limited the worst excesses of witch hunting. But for the vast majority of accused individuals, particularly poor women over 40 living in rural communities during times of economic stress, the machinery of persecution was designed to ensure their destruction. The tests were rigged, the torture was systematic, and the legal procedures were stacked against the accused. In this system, survival was not about proving innocence. It was about avoiding accusation in the first place. And once the whispers started, very few people possessed the resources or connections necessary to escape the grinding wheels of medieval justice. The witch trials of medieval and early modern Europe stand as one of history's most systematic campaigns of persecution, claiming tens of thousands of lives across 3 centuries of organized brutality. Understanding this dark chapter helps us recognize how fear, superstition, and economic incentives can combine to create legal systems that abandon justice in favor of predetermined outcomes. The question is not whether you could have survived a witch trial, but whether any of us would have been strong enough to resist participating in a system that turned neighbor against neighbor and transformed communities into hunting grounds for the vulnerable and defenseless. The terror truly begins when they come for you at dawn. 3 men from the village council, accompanied by the local priest, hammer on your wooden door while the morning mist still clings to the ground. You've been expecting this visit for days now, ever since old Henrik's cow died, and his wife started spreading whispers about the strange herbs you grow behind your cottage. Your hands shake as you lift the wooden bar that secures your door. The priest, Father Wilhelm, stands in the center of the group, his face grave beneath his woolen hood. Behind him, you recognize Johann the blacksmith and 2 other men, whose names you know, but whose friendship you've clearly lost. Their eyes hold a mixture of fear and determination that chills you more than the morning air. By order of the ecclesiastical court, Father Wilhelm announces, his voice carrying the weight of divine authority, you are summoned to answer charges of maleficium and consorting with diabolic forces. The Latin words hang in the air like an executioner's blade. Maleficium, harmful magic. In the legal language of medieval Europe, this single term could encompass everything from causing a neighbor's chickens to stop laying eggs to bringing plague upon an entire village. The accusation doesn't require proof in any sense that we would recognize today. It requires only suspicion, whispered testimony, and the willingness of authorities to believe that supernatural evil walks among them in human form. As they escort you through the village streets, you notice how your neighbors react to your passage. Some cross themselves and mutter prayers under their breath. Others stare openly, their faces displaying the peculiar mixture of fascination and revulsion that medieval people reserved for those they believed had trafficked with the devil. Children peek out from behind their mothers' skirts, already learning to fear what they don't understand. The house where they take you for initial questioning belongs to the village headman, a prosperous farmer whose stone foundation and glazed windows mark him as one of the community's most successful residents. Inside, a makeshift court has been assembled around his largest table. Several local officials sit behind it, flanked by a clerk whose ink-stained fingers hover over parchment that will record every word of the proceedings. The questioning begins immediately, without ceremony or explanation of your rights. In medieval legal systems, the concept of innocent until proven guilty didn't apply to cases involving witchcraft. Instead, the burden rested on you to prove your innocence against accusations that were, by their very nature, almost impossible to disprove. How do you demonstrate that you haven't made secret pacts with demons? How do you provide evidence of supernatural activities that supposedly occurred in private, witnessed only by the devil himself? Tell us about the night of the new moon, demands Johann the blacksmith, leaning forward across the table. Henrik's wife saw strange lights coming from your cottage window. What were you doing that required such secrecy? You try to explain that you were simply tending to your sick goat, using a lamp to check on the animal during the night. But even this innocent explanation becomes twisted in the context of witchcraft accusations. Why were you awake at such an unusual hour? Why did you need light to tend an animal? Could these lights have been signals to supernatural entities? The questions multiply, each answer generating new suspicions rather than clearing up old ones. The clerk scratches away with his quill, recording every hesitation, every nervous gesture, every word that could later be interpreted as evidence of guilt. Medieval court records were incredibly detailed when it came to witchcraft cases, preserving not just testimony, but observations about the accused's behavior, physical appearance, and emotional state. Everything about you is now potential evidence in a case where the verdict seems predetermined. Show us your hands, orders Father Wilhelm, and you have no choice but to extend your arms across the table. The priest and his companions examine your palms and fingers with the intensity of scholars studying ancient manuscripts. They're looking for any mark, scar, or blemish that could be interpreted as a devil's mark, the supernatural branding that witches supposedly received upon making their pacts with Satan. The examination is humiliating and invasive. They turn your hands this way and that, peering closely at a small scar from a childhood accident, debating in whispers whether a mole on your wrist might be supernatural in origin. Medieval people believed that these marks could change shape and colour, that they were insensitive to pain, and that they served as proof of diabolic alliance. Any imperfection in your skin becomes potential evidence against you. When they find nothing obviously suspicious on your hands, Father Wilhelm announces that a more thorough examination will be necessary. Your heart sinks as you realize what this means. The search for devil's marks and witches' teats was one of the most dreaded aspects of witch trials, requiring complete nudity and minute inspection of every inch of the accused's body by strangers who approached the task with a mixture of religious duty and prurient curiosity. But first, they want to test your knowledge of Christian doctrine. Recite the Lord's Prayer, commands the priest, without error or omission. This sounds simple enough, but your mouth has gone dry with fear, and the familiar words that you've spoken countless times suddenly feel foreign on your tongue. The psychological pressure of knowing that your life depends on perfect recitation makes even the most basic phrases difficult to remember. You begin hesitantly, "Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name." The men around the table watch your every syllable, ready to pounce on the slightest mistake. When you stumble slightly over, "Lead us not into temptation," you see them exchange meaningful glances. In their minds, this minor error confirms their suspicions. Medieval theology held that witches were incapable of speaking sacred words accurately because their diabolic allegiances corrupted their ability to invoke divine protection. "Again," orders Father Wilhelm, his voice now carrying a note of triumph. "Recite it again, perfectly." The second attempt goes somewhat better, but the damage has already been done. They've heard what they wanted to hear, interpreted your nervousness as supernatural inability rather than natural fear. The clerk makes careful notes about your difficulty with holy words, creating a permanent record that will follow you through whatever legal proceedings await. The preliminary examination concludes with a decision that you've probably been dreading since the moment they knocked on your door. You're to be held in custody pending a full investigation, which will include the complete range of tests and procedures designed to determine your guilt or innocence. In medieval Europe, this was essentially a death sentence delivered in bureaucratic language. The cell where they confine you is a stone chamber beneath the village church, originally designed for storing grain, but now repurposed for holding suspected witches. The walls weep moisture, the air smells of decay and fear, and the only light comes from a small window set high in the wall. You're not the first person to occupy this space, and the scratches on the stones tell stories of previous prisoners who carved their names or prayers into the rock while awaiting their fates. Days pass in a blur of interrogations, each session revealing new layers of accusation and suspicion. Other villagers come forward with testimony about suspicious activities they claim to have witnessed over the years. The widow Martha recalls that her late husband's illness began shortly after an argument with you about property boundaries. Young Peter swears he saw you talking to a black cat that disappeared when he approached. The baker's wife remembers that her bread failed to rise properly on the same day you visited her shop. Each piece of testimony, no matter how trivial or circumstantial, becomes part of a growing case against you. Medieval communities were small enough that everyone knew everyone else's business, but they were also large enough for misunderstandings, grudges, and forgotten details to multiply over time. Once the accusation process began, ordinary interactions were reinterpreted through the lens of supernatural suspicion. The most damning testimony comes from Henrik's wife, the woman whose accusations started this entire nightmare. She claims that you appeared to her in a dream, floating above her bed and threatening to harm her family if they didn't give you their best cow. When she refused, she says, "You vanished in a cloud of sulphurous smoke," and the cow was found dead the next morning. This type of spectral evidence was particularly difficult to defend against because it relied entirely on the accuser's claims about supernatural visitations that supposedly occurred in private. Medieval legal systems generally required multiple witnesses for serious accusations, but witchcraft cases operated under special rules that allowed single witness testimony and even dream evidence to carry significant weight in court proceedings. Your attempts to provide rational explanations for each accusation only seem to make things worse. When you point out that Henrik's cow was already sick before it died, they ask how you could have known about its illness unless you were responsible for causing it. When you mention that you grow herbs for medicinal purposes, they want to know who taught you such knowledge and whether you learned it from supernatural sources. Every answer generates new questions, new suspicions, new evidence of your supposed guilt. The legal proceedings drag on for weeks, during which time your physical and mental condition steadily deteriorates. The poor diet, lack of sunlight, and constant stress of facing death accusations take their toll on your body. Your appearance becomes increasingly haggard, which the authorities interpret as further evidence of your supernatural corruption rather than natural consequences of imprisonment and fear. Father Wilhelm visits your cell regularly, ostensibly to offer spiritual counseling, but actually to continue the interrogation process. He wants you to confess, to admit your guilt, and provide details about your alleged supernatural activities. He explains that confession is good for your soul, that it will allow you to die in a state of grace rather than in rebellion against God. The irony is crushing. A priest urging you to lie about crimes you never committed in order to achieve spiritual salvation. But you know, as everyone in medieval Europe knew, that confession meant certain death. While it might result in a quicker execution, strangled before burning rather than burned alive, it was still a death sentence delivered with religious ceremony. Those who maintained their innocence faced the possibility of more severe torture to extract admissions, but they also retained the slimmest hope that their cases might be dismissed, or that they might somehow prove their innocence through the various tests available. The decision to order your formal testing comes after a month of preliminary investigations. The authorities announce that you will be subjected to the swimming test, the most famous and widely used method for determining supernatural guilt or innocence. The news spreads through the village like wildfire, and preparations begin for what will essentially be a public execution disguised as a judicial procedure. The night before your test, you lie awake in your cell trying to understand the impossible logic that has brought you to this point. If you sink in the water tomorrow, you'll drown, but you'll die innocent in the eyes of the law. If you float, you'll have proven your guilt as a witch and face immediate execution by fire. There is no outcome that allows you to return to your cottage, tend your herbs, and live out your remaining years in peace. The morning of the test dawns grey and cold, with a persistent drizzle that turns the village paths into muddy streams. Despite the weather, hundreds of people have gathered at the mill pond to witness the proceedings. Word has spread to neighbouring villages, and spectators have travelled for hours to see the swimming of a witch. For many of them, this will be the most exciting event they witness all year. The crowd includes people you've known your entire life, neighbours who bought herbs from you, children you helped deliver into the world, men and women who once sought your advice about sick livestock or troubled pregnancies. Now they stand in the rain, waiting to watch you either drown or burn, their faces displaying a mixture of fear, excitement, and religious fervour that transforms familiar people into strangers. The officials have erected a small platform beside the pond where Father Wilhelm and the other authorities can observe the proceedings while remaining relatively dry. A collection basket circulates through the crowd, gathering coins to cover the expenses of the test and the subsequent execution. If you're found guilty, the commercialization of your potential death adds another layer of humiliation to an already degrading process. They strip you to your undergarments in full view of the crowd, ignoring your pleas for privacy and dignity. Medieval people were generally more comfortable with nudity than modern individuals, but this public exposure serves a specific purpose beyond mere necessity. It's designed to humiliate you, to reduce you from a human being with rights and dignity to an object of investigation and entertainment. The binding process is elaborate and ritualistic. They tie your right thumb to your left big toe and your left thumb to your right big toe, a configuration that makes swimming impossible and ensures that survival depends purely on body density and lung capacity. A rope around your waist supposedly allows for rescue if you sink, proving your innocence, but the practical difficulties of quickly pulling a bound person from deep water mean that drowning is a very real possibility, even for the innocent. Father Wilhelm offers a final prayer before the test begins, asking God to reveal the truth through divine intervention in the water's behavior. The theological justification for the swimming test rested on the belief that water, having been blessed in the sacrament of baptism, would reject anyone who had renounced their Christian faith through diabolic pacts. This religious framework made the procedure seem legitimate and even holy to medieval communities. The crowd falls silent as they carry you to the edge of the pond. The water is cold and dark, reflecting the grey sky like a mirror that reveals nothing but your own terrified face. You can hear your heart pounding in your chest, feel your breath coming in short gasps. Know that within moments you'll either be drowning or proven guilty of crimes you never committed. They throw you into the pond with ceremonial precision, and the cold water closes over your head like a liquid grave. For a moment, everything is silent and peaceful beneath the surface. The sounds of the crowd disappear, replaced by the muffled rushing of water in your ears. This could be the last sensation you ever experience, the final moment of a life that began in this village and now ends in its mill pond. But then you feel yourself rising toward the surface, your body's natural buoyancy carrying you upward, despite the bonds that prevent swimming. Your head breaks the water, and you gasp for air as the crowd erupts in shouts and screams. You've floated. You've failed the test. You've just proven, in the eyes of medieval law and theology, that you are indeed a witch in league with the devil. The authorities pull you from the water with grim efficiency, their faces showing no surprise at the outcome. Perhaps they never expected any other result. Perhaps the test was merely a formality to justify a predetermined conclusion. You'll never know whether your fate was sealed the moment Henrik's wife started spreading accusations, or whether you might have had some slim chance of survival if you'd sunk to the bottom of the pond. The crowd presses closer as they drag you from the water, their earlier silence replaced by angry murmurs and shouts of condemnation. Some call for immediate execution, unwilling to wait for formal sentencing. Others cross themselves and back away, as if proximity to a proven witch might contaminate them with supernatural evil. A few brave souls suggest that you should be given a chance to confess and repent, but their voices are drowned out by demands for swift justice. Father Wilhelm raises his hand for silence, and the crowd gradually quiets to hear his pronouncement. "The water has spoken," he declares, his voice carrying across the pond with practiced authority. "Divine justice has revealed the truth. This woman has renounced her baptism and entered into commerce with the Prince of Darkness. She is guilty of witchcraft and must face the prescribed punishment." The formal sentencing takes place immediately, without returning to the village or consulting higher authorities. Medieval witch trials often moved with shocking speed once guilt had been established through testing. The legal machinery was designed for efficiency rather than careful deliberation, reflecting the belief that proved witches represented immediate threats to community safety that required swift elimination. "By the authority vested in me by God and the Church," Father Wilhelm continues, "I sentence you to death by fire, to be carried out immediately, so that your evil influence may be purged from this community and your soul may have its final opportunity for repentance before facing divine judgment." The crowd roars its approval, and you realize that the spectacle is far from over. They're going to burn you alive, here and now, while hundreds of people watch and cheer. There will be no appeals, no time for reflection, no opportunity for rescue or escape. The swimming test was both trial and verdict, and the execution will follow as inevitably as night follows day. They march you through the village streets one final time, but now the procession has the atmosphere of a festival rather than a legal proceeding. Children run alongside the crowd, vendors sell food and drink to spectators, and someone starts singing a hymn that others quickly pick up. Your impending death has become a community celebration, a shared ritual that binds the village together through participation in what they believe is righteous violence. The execution site is a field just outside the village walls, where a pile of wood has already been prepared. Medieval communities kept supplies of fuel ready for witch burnings, recognizing that swift execution was often necessary to prevent unrest or attempts at rescue. The pyre is professionally constructed, designed to burn hot and fast while providing clear views for the assembled spectators. They tie you to a post in the center of the woodpile, your wet clothes clinging to your body as the afternoon wind cuts through you like a blade. The crowd forms a large circle around the pyre, maintaining enough distance to avoid the heat while ensuring good views of the proceedings. Some have brought stools or crates to stand on, treating your execution like a theatrical performance. Father Wilhelm approaches with a torch, offering you one final opportunity to confess your sins and seek forgiveness. The medieval church taught that even witches could achieve salvation through sincere repentance, though such repentance typically required detailed admissions of supernatural crimes. Your refusal to confess is interpreted not as evidence of innocence, but as diabolic stubbornness that confirms your guilt. "I am innocent," you manage to say through chattering teeth. "I have committed no crimes against God or man. I call upon heaven to witness my innocence and to judge those who have brought false accusations against me." Your words only inflame the crowd further. To them, your continued protestations of innocence prove that you remain in Satan's grip even in your final moments. They shout prayers and curses, calling upon God to reject your soul and send it to eternal torment. The medieval worldview left no room for the possibility that their tests might be flawed or their accusations mistaken. Father Wilhelm touches his torch to the kindling at the base of the pyre, and flames begin to lick upward through the dry wood. The fire catches quickly, sending up clouds of smoke that make your eyes water and your throat burn. The heat builds slowly at first, then with increasing intensity as the larger pieces of wood begin to burn in earnest. The crowd falls silent as the flames rise higher, watching with rapt attention as the fire does its work. Some cover their eyes or turn away when the reality of what they're witnessing becomes too intense, but most continue staring with the fascination that violence has always held for human beings. You are no longer a person to them, but a symbol of evil being destroyed by righteous fire. Through the smoke and flames, you can see faces in the crowd, people you've known your entire life watching you die. There's the baker whose wife accused you of ruining her bread. There's young Peter who claimed he saw you talking to supernatural cats. There's Henrik, whose wife's accusations started this entire nightmare, standing with his arms crossed and his face showing grim satisfaction. But there are also faces that show doubt, regret, or horror at what's happening. The midwife who trained you in herb lore stands at the back of the crowd with tears streaming down her face. Several children are crying, confused by the adults' celebration of death. Even some of the men who participated in your arrest look uncomfortable with the reality of watching someone burn alive. The fire burns for what feels like hours, but is probably only minutes. Medieval executioners sometimes showed mercy by strangling condemned witches before the flames could kill them, but no such mercy is offered here. Your death serves as both punishment and warning, a vivid demonstration of what happens to those who supposedly traffic with supernatural evil. When the flames finally die down, The crowd begins to disperse, their excitement fading as the reality of what they've witnessed sinks in. Some linger to examine the remains of the pyre, perhaps looking for signs that supernatural forces were indeed involved. Others hurry away, eager to return to their normal lives and forget the disturbing spectacle they've just participated in. The village returns to its ordinary routines, but something has changed. The fear that drove your persecution hasn't disappeared with your death. It has only grown stronger, fed by the apparent confirmation that witches do indeed walk among them. Within weeks, new accusations surface, new suspects are identified, and the machinery of persecution grinds forward to claim additional victims. Your cottage stands empty for a while, then is eventually torn down after rumours spread that it's haunted by your vengeful spirit. Your small plot of land is divided among your accusers, providing them with the material benefits they may have been seeking all along. The herbs you cultivated with such care are uprooted and burned, erasing the last traces of knowledge that might have helped future generations. But your story doesn't end with your death. It becomes part of the village's collective memory, told and retold as a cautionary tale about the dangers of supernatural evil and the necessity of constant vigilance against diabolic influences. Children grow up hearing about the witch who lived at the edge of the village, learning to fear anyone who seems different or unusual. Years pass, and new accusations arise. New victims face the same tests and procedures that condemned you. The swimming pond claims other lives. The execution field sees other fires. And the cycle of persecution continues with the relentless momentum of a machine designed to produce predetermined outcomes. Each new case seems to confirm the reality of witchcraft and the necessity of aggressive prosecution. The broader patterns of witch persecution that claimed your life were replicated thousands of times across medieval and early modern Europe. Between 1400 and 1775, over 100,000 people faced accusations of witchcraft, and between 40 and 60,000 were executed. The vast majority were women, most over 40, and nearly all were vulnerable members of their communities who lacked the resources or connections necessary to defend themselves effectively. The tests that condemned you, the swimming ordeal that proved your supposed guilt, were used countless times with the same deadly logic. The impossible choice between drowning and burning claimed thousands of lives, creating a legal framework where innocence was literally impossible to prove and survival depended on factors completely beyond the accused individual's control. The torture methods that might have been used to extract your confession, had you lived long enough to face them, broke the spirits and bodies of countless victims across Europe. The strappado, the rack, water torture, and systematic pricking destroyed thousands of lives while producing confessions that seemed to confirm the reality of supernatural conspiracies that existed only in the imaginations of terrified communities. The economic incentives that drove your persecution, the seizure of property, and the profits from professional witch hunting created self-perpetuating systems that consumed entire regions. The Bamberg witch trials, where special buildings were constructed to process the volume of accused individuals, demonstrated how persecution could become an industrial enterprise that generated enormous profits for its operators. The religious and legal frameworks that justified your execution were developed by learned men who believed they were protecting their communities from genuine supernatural threats. The Malleus Maleficarum and similar texts provided detailed instructions for identifying and prosecuting witches, creating systematic approaches to persecution that seemed scientific and rational to medieval minds. The social dynamics that led to your accusation, the community tensions and personal grudges that found expression through witchcraft charges, reflected deeper anxieties about social change, religious conflict, and economic uncertainty. Witch trials served as safety valves for communities under stress, providing scapegoats for misfortunes that had no obvious natural explanations. The gender dynamics that made you vulnerable to accusation were deeply embedded in medieval society's beliefs about women's spiritual weakness and susceptibility to demonic influence. The systematic targeting of older women, particularly those who lived independently or possessed valuable property, revealed how witch trials functioned as mechanisms for eliminating inconvenient individuals and redistributing their assets. The medical ignorance that allowed ordinary symptoms to be interpreted as evidence of supernatural activity created additional vulnerabilities for anyone who became ill or behaved unusually. Epilepsy, mental illness, ergot poisoning, and other conditions that medieval medicine couldn't explain became proof of diabolic influence rather than natural disease. The legal procedures that condemned you operated under special rules that abandoned normal protections for the accused and made conviction virtually inevitable. The reversal of the burden of proof, the acceptance of spectral evidence, the use of torture to extract confessions, and the reliance on impossible tests created a system designed to produce guilty verdicts rather than determine truth. The community participation in your execution reflected the collective nature of witch persecution, where entire populations became complicit in systematic violence against their most vulnerable members. The festival atmosphere surrounding witch burnings, the economic benefits derived from confiscated property, and the psychological satisfaction of eliminating supposed threats created powerful incentives for continued persecution. The persistence of witch beliefs long after official trials ended demonstrated how deeply these ideas had penetrated European consciousness during the centuries of systematic persecution. Informal violence against suspected witches continued well into the modern era, showing that legal reforms alone couldn't immediately change popular attitudes towards supernatural threats. Your fictional story represents the reality faced by tens of thousands of real people who lived through this dark chapter in European history. Their names are recorded in court documents, their confessions preserved in official archives, their deaths documented in parish records that provide stark testimony to one of history's most systematic campaigns of persecution. The witch trials of medieval and early modern Europe stand as monuments to the dangers of fear, superstition, and unchecked authority. They demonstrate how communities can turn against their most vulnerable members, how legal systems can be corrupted to serve predetermined outcomes, and how religious beliefs can be weaponized to justify systematic violence. Understanding this history helps us recognize similar patterns in our own time, when fear and suspicion can still drive communities to turn against individuals or groups deemed threatening or different. The mechanisms of persecution may have changed, but the underlying human tendencies that drove witch hunting remain present in every society. The question of whether you could have survived a witch trial in medieval Europe isn't really about individual strength or innocence. It's about recognizing that the entire system was designed to produce victims rather than justice, to eliminate threats rather than determine truth, and to reinforce existing power structures rather than protect the innocent. For most people accused of witchcraft, survival wasn't a matter of proving innocence or passing tests fairly. It was a matter of avoiding accusation in the first place, and once the whispers started, very few possessed the resources, connections, or pure luck necessary to escape the machinery of persecution that ground forward with relentless efficiency across 3 centuries of European history. So as we reach the end of our journey through this dark chapter of human history, I want you to consider the broader implications of what we've just witnessed together. The story of witch persecution isn't just ancient history gathering dust in academic libraries. It's a blueprint for how ordinary people can become complicit in systematic violence, how communities can turn fear into weapons, and how the most vulnerable members of society become targets when collective anxiety needs an outlet. Think about the mechanisms that made witch trials possible. Communities under stress, looking for someone to blame for their misfortunes. Legal systems that abandon normal protections in favor of predetermined outcomes. Religious authorities who provided theological justification for violence. Economic incentives that made persecution profitable. Social dynamics that targeted the most vulnerable while protecting the powerful. These patterns didn't disappear when the last witch was executed in the 18th century Europe. They reappear whenever societies face uncertainty, whenever communities need scapegoats, whenever fear becomes more powerful than reason. The specific targets may change, the methods may evolve, but the underlying dynamics remain remarkably consistent across different times and places. The medieval villager who watched his neighbour burn alive, convinced he was witnessing divine justice, wasn't necessarily evil in any simple sense. He was responding to pressures and beliefs that made persecution seem not just acceptable, but necessary for community survival. The authorities who designed impossible tests and extracted confessions through torture believed they were protecting society from genuine supernatural threats. This doesn't excuse their actions, but it helps us understand how systematic persecution develops and persists. It's not usually the result of individual malice, but of collective dynamics that transform ordinary people into participants in extraordinary violence. The witch trials succeeded because they offered simple explanations for complex problems, clear enemies for diffuse anxieties, and immediate actions for communities that felt helpless in the face of forces beyond their control. The women who died in these trials, and the smaller number of men who joined them, weren't victims of random violence or spontaneous mob fury. They were casualties of systematic persecution that operated according to its own internal logic, followed established procedures, and drew support from the most educated and influential members of medieval society. Their deaths were legal, theological, and socially sanctioned acts of violence that entire communities participated in or witnessed with approval. Understanding this history changes how we think about justice, community, and the protection of vulnerable individuals. It reminds us that legal systems can be corrupted, that religious authority can be weaponized, and that communities can turn against their own members with shocking speed and brutality. It shows us that the line between civilization and barbarism is thinner than we like to believe. The witch trials also reveal the particular vulnerabilities that certain groups faced in medieval society. Women, especially older women living independently, were systematically targeted because their autonomy challenged social norms and their property was valuable to others. Healers and midwives found their knowledge transformed from community resource to evidence of supernatural corruption. The poor and socially isolated became easy targets because they lacked the connections necessary to defend themselves. These targeting patterns reflect broader power structures that used witch persecution to eliminate inconvenient individuals and redistribute their resources. The trials weren't just about supernatural beliefs. They were about social control, economic opportunity, and the maintenance of established hierarchies. Fear of witchcraft became a tool for enforcing conformity and eliminating challenges to existing authority. The psychological dimensions of witch persecution deserve particular attention because they help explain how entire communities became complicit in systematic violence. The trials offered participants a sense of agency in the face of incomprehensible misfortunes, a feeling of moral superiority over those deemed evil, and the satisfaction of participating in what they believed was cosmic justice. The communal nature of witch hunting created bonds between participants while isolating victims. The spectacle elements of witch trials, from the public examinations to the festival atmosphere surrounding executions, transformed persecution into entertainment that drew crowds from surrounding areas. This commercialization of violence made the trials economically beneficial for many participants, while normalizing extreme brutality as acceptable community activity. The role of children in witch trials reveals another disturbing aspect of these prosecutions. Young accusers were often coached or influenced by adults who had already decided on the guilt of the accused. The special weight given to children's testimony, based on assumptions about their innocence and inability to lie convincingly, created opportunities for manipulation that destroyed lives while claiming to protect the young from supernatural threats. The medical ignorance that contributed to witch accusations shows how lack of scientific understanding can be weaponized against vulnerable individuals. Symptoms of epilepsy, mental illness, ergot poisoning, and other conditions became evidence of supernatural corruption rather than natural disease. The absence of effective medical treatments meant that unusual behaviors or unexplained illnesses were often attributed to malevolent magic. The seasonal and geographic patterns of witch persecution reveal how external stresses influence the timing and intensity of accusations. Failed harvests, severe weather, disease outbreaks, and other community crises often preceded waves of witch hunting as people desperately sought explanations for their misfortunes. Certain regions became notorious for particularly intense campaigns, while others remained relatively untouched. The professional development of witch hunting as a specialized occupation demonstrates how persecution became institutionalized and systematic rather than spontaneous. Figures like Matthew Hopkins developed standardized procedures, traveled extensively to offer their services, and made substantial profits from their expertise in identifying supernatural threats. This professionalization gave witch hunting an appearance of scientific legitimacy that masked its arbitrary and destructive nature. The legal innovations that made witch trials possible represented significant departures from established judicial principles. The acceptance of spectral evidence, the reversal of burden of proof, the use of torture to extract confessions, and the reliance on impossible tests created special procedures that guaranteed conviction rather than determining truth. These innovations were justified by claims that supernatural crimes required supernatural methods of detection. The theological frameworks that supported witch persecution drew on centuries of Christian thought about the reality of supernatural evil and the necessity of eliminating diabolic influences from human communities. The elaborate theories developed by church authorities about how witchcraft operated, what powers witches possessed, and how they could be identified provided intellectual respectability for systematic violence. The economic structures that made persecution profitable created powerful incentives for continued and expanded witch hunting. The seizure of condemned individuals' property, the fees charged by professional witch hunters, and the costs of trials and executions that were often charged to victims' families created a system where persecution generated revenue for many participants. The social functions served by witch trials extended far beyond their stated purpose of eliminating supernatural threats. They provided mechanisms for resolving property disputes, settling personal grudges, eliminating social rivals, and redistributing resources within communities. They offered cathartic release for collective anxieties while reinforcing existing power structures and social hierarchies. The decline of witch trials occurred gradually as legal reforms, educational advances, and changing intellectual attitudes made their arbitrary nature increasingly obvious to authorities. The scientific revolution and Enlightenment thinking provided alternative explanations for phenomena that had previously been attributed to supernatural causes. Economic development made the climate of fear and unpredictability created by witch hunts seem counterproductive to prosperity. But the end of official witch trials didn't immediately end witch persecution. Informal violence against suspected witches continued well into the modern era in many parts of Europe, demonstrating how deeply these beliefs had penetrated popular consciousness. The persistence of witch-hunting mentalities long after legal changes shows how difficult it can be to eliminate systematic persecution once it becomes embedded in cultural practices. The historical lessons of witch persecution remain relevant today, as we face our own challenges with fear, scapegoating, and the protection of vulnerable individuals. The mechanisms that made medieval witch trials possible, communities under stress seeking someone to blame, authorities abandoning normal protections in favor of predetermined outcomes, and collective participation in violence against designated enemies, continue to appear in different forms across the world. Understanding how witch trials developed and operated helps us recognize similar patterns in our own time and strengthens our commitment to protecting legal procedures, maintaining skepticism about extraordinary claims, and defending the rights of vulnerable individuals even when they're unpopular or feared by the majority. The tens of thousands of people who died in European witch trials deserve to be remembered not just as victims of historical curiosity, but as casualties of systematic persecution that reveals important truths about human nature, community dynamics, and the fragility of justice. Their stories remind us that civilization is not a permanent achievement, but something that must be actively maintained and defended against the forces that would destroy it. So let me ask you directly, after everything we've explored together, after walking through the impossible logic of medieval witch trials, after witnessing the systematic nature of persecution that claimed so many lives, do you think you could have survived? Could you have navigated the deadly maze of accusations, tests, and legal procedures that were designed to produce victims rather than justice? More importantly, would you have been strong enough to resist participating in a system that turned neighbors against neighbors, that transformed fear into violence, and that destroyed lives in the name of protecting communities? Would you have spoken up for the accused when doing so might have made you the next target? Would you have questioned the methods when everyone around you believed they were necessary and righteous? These aren't just historical questions. They're challenges that every generation faces in different forms. Tests of our commitment to justice, truth, and the protection of vulnerable individuals even when it's difficult or dangerous to do so. The witch trials ended centuries ago, but the human capacities that made them possible remain with us today. The next time you encounter fear-driven accusations against unpopular individuals or groups, remember the lessons of medieval witch persecution. The next time you see communities turning against their most vulnerable members, think about the dynamics that made witch trials possible. The next time legal protections are abandoned in favor of predetermined outcomes, recall the impossible tests that condemned thousands of innocent people to death. History doesn't repeat exactly, but it rhymes in patterns that span centuries and continents. The witch trials of medieval Europe weren't unique aberrations, but examples of human tendencies that appear whenever the right conditions align. Understanding this history is our best defense against repeating its worst mistakes. The question isn't whether you could have survived a witch trial. The question is whether you would have the courage to prevent the next one. The aftermath of your execution ripples through the village like stones thrown into still water. Your death was supposed to bring peace, to end the mysterious misfortunes that had plagued the community for months. Instead, it seems to have unleashed something far worse. Within a week of your burning, new accusations begin to surface. The baker's apprentice claims he saw strange lights dancing in the field where your ashes were scattered. A merchant's wife insists that her youngest child has been speaking in tongues since witnessing your execution. The miller reports that his grain has been spoiling at an alarming rate, despite the dry weather that should have preserved it perfectly. Fear breeds fear in medieval communities, and your death has created a template that others quickly learn to exploit. Old grudges resurface disguised as supernatural accusations. Property disputes transform into witchcraft charges. Personal vendettas hide behind claims of diabolic conspiracy. The machinery of persecution that claimed your life begins grinding forward again, seeking fresh victims to feed its insatiable appetite. The first new accusation comes from an unexpected source. Henrik's wife, the woman whose initial claims started your downfall, now points her finger at another neighbour. She claims that Margaret, the weaver who lives near the market square, visited her in a dream and threatened revenge for your execution. According to her testimony, Margaret appeared floating above her bed, surrounded by a swirling cloud of darkness, promising that Henrik's family would suffer for their role in destroying an innocent woman. The irony is breathtaking. Margaret had been one of the few villagers who spoke in your defense, who questioned whether the accusations against you were justified, who suggested that natural explanations might exist for the misfortunes attributed to your supernatural malevolence. Now, her very defense of you becomes evidence of her own guilt, proof that she was part of a diabolic conspiracy that extended beyond a single individual. The authorities who presided over your trial are eager to pursue this new lead. Father Wilhelm announces from the pulpit that Satan's influence has not been fully purged from the community, that additional witches clearly remain hidden among the faithful, waiting for opportunities to strike back against those who serve divine justice. The successful prosecution of one witch, he explains, often reveals the existence of others, like pulling a single thread that unravels an entire tapestry of evil. Margaret's arrest follows the same pattern that led to your destruction. The dawn visit from village officials, the frightened faces of neighbours who once counted her as a friend, the terrifying procession through familiar streets that now seem alien and hostile. But Margaret possesses something you lacked: a grown son who works as a clerk in the regional capital, a man with education and connections who understands how the legal system operates. Young Thomas races home as soon as word reaches him of his mother's arrest. He brings with him not just determination to save his mother, but actual knowledge of legal procedures and contacts among educated officials who might be willing to question the methods being used in his village. For the first time since the witch hunting began, the authorities face opposition from someone who understands their tactics and possesses the resources to challenge them. Thomas demands to see the evidence against his mother, pointing out inconsistencies in witness testimony and questioning the reliability of spectral evidence that depends entirely on the accuser's claims about supernatural visitations. He brings law books from the regional court, citing precedents that require higher standards of proof for capital charges. Most importantly, he threatens to appeal the case to higher authorities who might not approve of the informal procedures being used. The local officials find themselves in an uncomfortable position. They've grown accustomed to operating without oversight, processing witch cases with speed and efficiency that maximize both their authority and their profits. Thomas's intervention introduces complications they're not equipped to handle. Legal challenges that require more sophisticated responses than intimidation and torture. But the machinery of persecution has its own momentum that proves difficult to stop once it begins turning. Too many people have invested too much in the witch-hunting enterprise to abandon it easily. The economic benefits from confiscated property, the social status gained from participating in righteous violence, the psychological satisfaction of eliminating perceived threats, all create powerful incentives for continuing the campaign against suspected witches. Father Wilhelm adapts his strategy to counter Thomas's legal challenges. If educated authorities might question the methods being used, then the solution is to ensure that such authorities never get the chance to intervene. He accelerates the timeline for Margaret's trial, announces that urgent circumstances require immediate resolution, and declares that any delays might allow diabolic forces to interfere with divine justice. The swimming test for Margaret is scheduled for the very next day, despite Thomas's protests that his mother deserves adequate time to prepare her defense. The crowd that gathers at the mill pond is even larger than the one that witnessed your execution, drawn by curiosity about whether this new accused witch will meet the same fate as her predecessor. But something has changed in the village's atmosphere. Your death, which was supposed to demonstrate the community's commitment to righteousness, has instead planted seeds of doubt in some minds. A few villagers whisper that you might have been innocent after all, that the continued misfortunes suggest your execution failed to address the real problems. These doubts remain carefully private, expressed only in hushed conversations between trusted friends, but they represent a crack in the consensus that made persecution possible. Margaret's swimming test produces the same impossible outcome that condemned you. She floats in the cold water of the mill pond, her bound body refusing to sink despite her obvious terror and the weight of her waterlogged clothing. The crowd reacts with familiar shouts of condemnation, but the voices seem less certain than before, the enthusiasm somewhat forced. Thomas watches his mother fail the test with anguish that transforms into fury. As they drag Margaret from the pond, he steps forward to address the crowd directly, something that would have been unthinkable during your trial when authority went unquestioned. His voice carries across the water as he challenges the fundamental logic of the procedure they've just witnessed. You've just watched an innocent woman float in water, he declares, his education evident in every carefully chosen word. but consider what you've actually seen. My mother is well fed, with sufficient body fat to provide buoyancy. She's wearing thick wool clothing that traps air and increases flotation. She's bound in a position that prevents swimming but doesn't prevent floating. Any person subjected to this test under these conditions would produce the same result. The crowd shifts uncomfortably as Thomas continues his analysis. You've created a test where the outcome is predetermined, where survival proves guilt and death proves innocence. This isn't divine judgment. This is a method designed to produce the results you want, regardless of truth. Nor, Father Wilhelm interrupts before Thomas can say more, declaring that such challenges to divine justice prove the speaker has been corrupted by diabolic influence. But the seed has been planted. Some villagers begin to question whether the tests they've been witnessing actually reveal supernatural truth or simply demonstrate the effects of physical laws they don't fully understand. The authorities proceed with Margaret's execution despite Thomas's protests, but the ceremony lacks the festive atmosphere that accompanied your burning. Doubt has crept into the proceedings like morning fog, cooling the enthusiasm of participants and spectators alike. Some villagers attend out of obligation rather than conviction, going through the motions of communal righteousness, while harboring private reservations about what they're witnessing. Margaret dies, as you did, tied to a post in the execution field while flames consume the wood piled around her. But her death marks the beginning of the end for the witch-hunting campaign that claimed your life. Thomas's challenges have introduced questions that prove difficult to suppress, legal objections that require more sophisticated responses than the local authorities can provide. Word of the irregularities in the village's witch trials reaches the regional capital, carried by Thomas and other concerned parties who possess the education and connections necessary to bring these matters to higher attention. Officials, who might normally ignore complaints from rural peasants, are forced to take notice when the accusations come from educated clerks who understand proper legal procedures. An investigation is ordered, led by a trained jurist from the regional court who brings with him a skeptical attitude toward the informal methods that have been employed. This investigator has seen witch trials conducted according to proper legal standards, with multiple witnesses, careful examination of evidence, and adherence to established procedures that protect the innocent, while ensuring that genuine malefactors face appropriate punishment. What he finds in your village horrifies him. Court records that consist of little more than accusations and predetermined conclusions. Witness testimony that relies heavily on dreams, rumours, and spectral evidence that would be inadmissible in properly conducted trials. Test procedures that guarantee guilty verdicts regardless of the accused individual's actual innocence or guilt. Economic arrangements that create powerful incentives for continued persecution. The investigator's report to higher authorities results in immediate changes to how witch trials are conducted in the region. New requirements for evidence, mandatory appeals processes, oversight by trained legal officials, and restrictions on the use of torture and impossible tests. The informal system that claimed your life is dismantled and replaced with procedures that, while still flawed by modern standards, at least provide some protection for the accused. Father Wilhelm finds himself transferred to a remote monastery where his enthusiasm for witch hunting can be channeled into more appropriate religious activities. The village officials who participated in your trial face sanctions that range from financial penalties to removal from their positions. The professional witch hunters who profited from the persecution are banned from operating in the region. But these reforms come too late to save you, or Margaret, or the dozens of other victims who died before authorities recognized the systematic nature of the injustices being perpetrated. Your deaths serve as tragic reminders of what happens when fear overwhelms reason, when communities abandon legal protections in favor of predetermined outcomes, when persecution becomes profitable for those in power. The village gradually returns to something resembling normal life, but the scars from the witch-hunting period remain visible for years to come. Families torn apart by accusations never fully reconcile. properties seized from executed witches remain sources of ongoing dispute. Children who witnessed the burnings carry traumatic memories that influence their behavior throughout their lives. Some villagers emigrate to other regions, seeking fresh starts in communities where they aren't known as participants in or survivors of systematic persecution. Others remain, but find their relationships permanently altered by the knowledge of what they witnessed or participated in during the months of fear and violence. The social fabric of the community has been rewoven with different threads, creating patterns of trust and suspicion that will influence interactions for generations. The economic impact of the witch hunting campaign extends far beyond the immediate costs of trials and executions. The loss of productive community members, the disruption of traditional knowledge networks, and the climate of fear that discouraged innovation and entrepreneurship all contribute to long-term decline in the village's prosperity. Recovery takes decades if it occurs at all. The church where Father Wilhelm once preached about diabolic threats struggles to regain the trust of parishioners who now question religious authority that led them so far astray. The new priest who replaces Wilhelm focuses on themes of forgiveness and healing, trying to help the community process the trauma of its recent experience while rebuilding faith that had been weaponized for destructive purposes. Your cottage site remains empty for years, marked only by the foundation stones and the memory of the woman who once tended herbs there. Eventually, someone builds a new structure on the land, but locals continue to refer to it as the witch's plot, keeping alive the memory of persecution long after its victims have been forgotten by the broader world. The mill pond where you failed the swimming test becomes a place that children are warned to avoid, not because of any genuine supernatural danger, but because of the traumatic associations it holds for community members who witnessed the drownings and near-drownings that occurred there. The site takes on a haunted quality that reflects not supernatural presence, but collective guilt and unprocessed trauma. Regional authorities use your village's experience as a cautionary tale when training officials in proper legal procedures for handling witchcraft accusations. The case studies drawn from your trial and those that followed demonstrate clearly how informal methods can produce systematic injustices that undermine rather than serve the cause of justice. Legal scholars write treatises analyzing the failures of the witch-hunting campaign, identifying specific procedural flaws that led to wrongful convictions and suggesting reforms that might prevent similar tragedies in the future. Your death contributes to a growing body of literature that questions the reliability of traditional witch identification methods and advocates for higher standards of evidence in supernatural crime cases. The broader pattern of which your story forms a part begins to attract attention from educated observers across Europe. Natural philosophers start proposing alternative explanations for phenomena that had traditionally been attributed to witchcraft. Medical practitioners develop better understanding of conditions that had been interpreted as evidence of supernatural influence. Legal theorists advocate for procedural reforms that would protect the innocent while maintaining the possibility of prosecuting genuine supernatural crimes. But change comes slowly to rural communities where traditional beliefs run deep and educational opportunities remain limited. Many villages continue employing the same methods that claimed your life, producing new victims who face the same impossible choices between drowning and burning, between maintaining their innocence and confessing to crimes they never committed. The systematic nature of witch persecution means that your individual tragedy is multiplied thousands of times across Europe during the peak years of the hunting campaigns. Each victim faces the same terrifying progression from accusation to testing to execution. Each community experiences the same social disruption and economic exploitation. Each legal system struggles with the same tensions between traditional procedures and special measures designed for supernatural crimes. Your story represents not an isolated incident, but a common pattern that reveals fundamental truths about human nature, community dynamics, and the fragility of justice when faced with collective fear and institutional corruption. The mechanisms that led to your death, the community pressures that made persecution seem necessary, the legal innovations that abandoned traditional protections, all appear repeatedly across different times and places. Understanding your experience and the broader historical context in which it occurred helps us recognize similar patterns in our own time. The targeting of vulnerable individuals, the use of impossible tests to justify predetermined outcomes, the economic incentives that make persecution profitable, the community participation in systematic violence all represent human tendencies that transcend specific historical periods. The witch trials of medieval and early modern Europe weren't aberrations, but examples of possibilities that exist within every human society when the right conditions align. Fear, uncertainty, economic stress, weak legal institutions, and religious extremism can combine to create environments where persecution flourishes, and innocent people die for crimes that exist only in the imaginations of their accusers. Your fictional story, based on thousands of real cases documented in court records across Europe, reminds us that civilization is not a permanent achievement, but something that must be actively defended against forces that would destroy it. The legal protections, scientific understanding, and social institutions that we take for granted represent hard-won victories over the same human tendencies that made witch hunting possible. The question of whether you could have survived a witch trial remains relevant not just as historical curiosity, but as a test of our commitment to justice, truth, and the protection of vulnerable individuals. The methods may change, the targets may shift, but the underlying dynamics that made medieval persecution possible continue to exist in every human community. So as we reach the end of this dark journey through one of history's most systematic campaigns of persecution, let me ask you once more, do you think you could have survived? Not just physically, but morally? Could you have maintained your commitment to truth and justice when everyone around you believed that lies and violence were necessary for community survival? More importantly, would you recognize the warning signs if similar dynamics began emerging in your own community? Would you have the courage to speak up for the vulnerable when doing so might make you the next target? Would you question authority when everyone else accepts it without reservation? The witch trials ended centuries ago, but the human capacities that made them possible remain with us today. Understanding this history is our best defense against repeating its worst mistakes. The victims of medieval witch persecution deserve to be remembered not just as casualties of ancient superstition, but as warnings about what can happen when fear becomes stronger than reason and persecution becomes more profitable than justice. Their deaths teach us that ordinary people can become complicit in extraordinary evil when the right pressures align. Their stories remind us that legal systems can be corrupted, that religious authority can be weaponized, and that communities can turn against their most vulnerable members with shocking speed and brutal efficiency. But their memory also inspires us to do better, to build stronger protections for the innocent, to maintain higher standards for evidence and procedure, and to resist the human tendencies that transform neighbors into enemies and fear into violence. The witch trials are over, but the vigilance they demand of us continues every day. In the end, the question isn't whether you could have survived a witch trial. The question is whether you'll help ensure that nothing like them ever happens again. The transformation of your village in the weeks following Margaret's execution reveals something even more sinister than the witch trials themselves. The taste of blood has awakened something primal in the community, a hunger for more victims that grows stronger with each successful prosecution. What began as desperate attempts to explain misfortune has evolved into a self-sustaining industry of persecution that feeds on itself like a serpent devouring its own tail. The authorities quickly discover that witch hunting generates more than just spiritual satisfaction. Each successful prosecution brings immediate financial rewards through property confiscation, court fees, and the various expenses charged to victims' families. The economic model is elegantly simple and brutally effective. Accusation leads to investigation, investigation leads to testing, testing leads to conviction, and conviction leads to profit for everyone involved except the person burning at the stake. Professional witch hunters begin arriving from other regions, drawn by reports of successful prosecutions and the promise of lucrative contracts. These specialists bring with them years of experience in identifying supernatural threats, sophisticated equipment for conducting tests, and detailed knowledge of the most effective torture methods for extracting confessions. They operate like traveling merchants, but their commodity is death delivered with legal authority and religious blessing. Matthew Hopkins would have been perfectly at home in your village during these dark months. The self-proclaimed witchfinder general made a fortune traveling across England during the chaos of the Civil War, offering his services to communities convinced they harbored supernatural threats. Hopkins charged substantial fees for his expertise, employed assistants who helped conduct examinations and tests, and maintained detailed records of his successes that served as marketing materials for future clients. Hopkins perfected the art of making witch hunting profitable for everyone involved. He charged fees for initial consultations, additional costs for conducting tests, extra payments for extended investigations, and bonus compensation for successful prosecutions. The communities that hired him recovered these expenses by seizing the property of convicted witches, creating a system where persecution literally paid for itself while generating substantial profits for its operators. The methods Hopkins employed were designed to guarantee success, regardless of actual guilt or innocence. He used sleep deprivation to break down resistance, employed leading questions to extract desired confessions, and relied on accomplices who could identify supernatural marks that justified his conclusions. His victims faced an assembly line of persecution that moved with mechanical efficiency from accusation to execution. Your village's authorities adopt similar methods as they expand their operations beyond individual cases to systematic campaigns. They establish regular schedules for examinations, standardize their testing procedures, and create efficient workflows that can process multiple accused witches simultaneously. The special building constructed in Bamberg specifically for handling witch trials becomes their model for industrial-scale persecution. The Witch House of Bamberg stands as perhaps history's most chilling monument to the bureaucratization of murder. Constructed in 1627 by Prince Bishop Julius Ector, this facility was designed specifically to handle the massive volume of accused witches flowing through the court system. It contained holding cells, torture chambers, examination rooms, and administrative offices, all under one roof, creating a streamlined facility for converting accusations into executions. Inside the witch house, torture was employed without restriction, a policy that produced not just confessions, but exponential expansion of the accused population. Each broken victim provided investigators with dozens of new names, creating cascading waves of accusations that consumed entire families and neighborhoods. The building operated with the efficiency of a factory, processing human lives with the same methodical precision that mills processed grain. The torture methods employed in Bamberg and similar facilities were carefully designed to maximize both physical suffering and the extraction of useful information. Thumbscrews slowly crushed finger bones while allowing victims to remain conscious and capable of speech. Leg vises gradually compressed limbs until bones shattered, creating agony that could be precisely controlled and extended over hours or days. The strappado dislocated shoulders and tore muscles while leaving relatively few visible marks that might complicate legal proceedings. But the most devastating aspect of the Bamberg system wasn't the physical torture. It was the psychological warfare that preceded and accompanied it. Victims were kept in solitary confinement for weeks or months before their first interrogation, weakening their mental resistance through isolation and uncertainty. They could hear the screams of other prisoners being tortured in adjacent rooms, feeding their imaginations with horrific anticipations of what awaited them. The combination of psychological and physical pressure proved devastatingly effective at producing the confessions that authorities needed to justify their actions. Victims didn't just admit to practicing witchcraft, They provided detailed accounts of attending midnight Sabbaths, engaging in sexual relations with demons, and participating in elaborate conspiracies to destroy Christian civilization. These confessions seem to confirm the most paranoid fears of medieval communities while providing legal justification for continued persecution. The sexual elements of these forced confessions reveal the deep anxieties about female sexuality that drove much of the witch-hunting enterprise. Women were compelled to describe intimate encounters with Satan himself, providing graphic details that satisfied both the prurient interests of male interrogators and theological theories about how diabolic pacts were consummated. The focus on sexual transgression reinforced existing prejudices about women's supposed moral weakness and susceptibility to supernatural temptation. These confession narratives followed remarkably consistent patterns across different regions and time periods, reflecting not genuine supernatural experiences, but the leading questions and theological expectations of their extractors. Torturers used established texts, like the Malleus Maleficarum, as guides for the types of admissions they needed to obtain, creating feedback loops where torture-induced confessions seemed to confirm scholarly theories about witchcraft operations. The Malleus Maleficarum, published in 1487 by Heinrich Kraumer and Jacob Sprenger, provided the intellectual framework that made systematic witch persecution seem both necessary and scientifically justified. This influential text offered detailed explanations of how witches operated, what powers they possessed, and how they could be identified and eliminated. It wasn't fringe literature, but mainstream scholarship that influenced legal proceedings across Europe for centuries. The Malleus presented witchcraft as a vast conspiracy against Christian civilization, orchestrated by Satan and implemented through networks of human collaborators who had traded their souls for supernatural powers. According to this theory, witches could cause illness in humans and animals, destroy crops through weather manipulation, prevent conception and cause miscarriages, and even fly through the air to attend nocturnal gatherings where they worshipped their diabolic master. This elaborate mythology provided authorities with explanations for virtually any misfortune that might befall a community. Crop failures, livestock diseases, human illnesses, sudden deaths, and even bad weather could all be attributed to malevolent witchcraft rather than natural causes. The theory was comprehensive enough to account for any evidence, while flexible enough to adapt to local circumstances and particular accusations. The legal innovations justified by Malleus and similar texts represented radical departures from traditional judicial procedures that had protected accused individuals for centuries. Normal requirements for multiple witnesses were waived in favor of single accuser testimony. Physical evidence became unnecessary when spectral evidence from dreams and visions was accepted as valid. The presumption of innocence was effectively reversed, requiring accused individuals to prove their innocence rather than forcing prosecutors to prove guilt. These procedural changes were justified by claims that supernatural crimes required supernatural methods of detection and prosecution. Traditional legal safeguards were presented as obstacles to divine justice, rather than protections for the innocent. Torture was reframed as a necessary tool for overcoming the supernatural resistance that witches supposedly possessed against normal interrogation methods. The economic incentives that drove these legal innovations created powerful motivations for expanded and continued persecution. Property seizure laws allowed authorities to confiscate everything owned by convicted witches, from land and livestock to household goods and personal possessions. These assets were typically divided between the court, local officials, and sometimes the original accusers, creating multiple parties with financial interests in successful prosecutions. The costs associated with witch trials were often charged to the accused or their families, creating perverse situations where victims literally paid for their own persecution. Fees for imprisonment, torture, legal proceedings, and execution could bankrupt families while enriching the officials who conducted them. This economic structure meant that witch hunting became self-sustaining, generating the resources necessary for continued operations, while providing substantial profits for its operators. Professional witch hunters, like Matthew Hopkins, capitalized on these economic opportunities by offering specialized services to communities that wanted supernatural threats eliminated but lacked the expertise to conduct proper investigations. Hopkins charged fees that could amount to several years' wages for ordinary workers. But communities were willing to pay because successful prosecutions more than covered the costs through property confiscations. The geographic spread of witch hunting techniques reveals how successful methods were copied and adapted across different regions. Professional witch hunters traveled extensively, carrying their expertise from community to community like merchants selling specialized goods. Books describing identification procedures were distributed along trade routes, ensuring that innovations developed in one area quickly spread to others, seeking to improve their own persecution campaigns. Border regions where different legal systems met often became hotspots for witch persecution, as accused individuals fled from one jurisdiction, only to encounter similar or worse treatment in neighboring territories. The lack of standardized procedures meant that someone who might receive relatively fair treatment in one area could face almost certain execution just a few miles away under a different court system. The role of religious authorities in witch persecution varied significantly between Catholic and Protestant regions, but both traditions contributed essential elements to the theoretical and practical frameworks that made systematic persecution possible. Catholic areas often relied on experienced inquisitors who brought centuries of expertise gained from hunting heretics and other enemies of the Church. Protestant regions typically employed secular authorities working closely with Reformed clergy who had their own theological reasons for believing in the reality of diabolic threats. The Counter-Reformation intensified Catholic persecution of witches as part of broader campaigns to purify the Church and eliminate all forms of heretical belief from Christian territories. Protestant areas experienced parallel waves of persecution as reforming clergy sought to establish their authority and demonstrate their commitment to biblical Christianity against both Catholic rivals and supernatural enemies. Individual religious figures played crucial roles in either promoting or restraining witch persecution within their jurisdictions. Some bishops and pastors became enthusiastic witch hunters who saw persecution as religious duty that served both earthly justice and divine will. Others expressed skepticism about accusations and worked to protect innocent individuals from false charges, though such voices often found themselves overwhelmed by popular demand for action against perceived supernatural threats. The training and education of religious authorities significantly influenced their approaches to witch accusations and the legal procedures they supported or opposed. Clergy with university educations and exposure to scholarly theological works were more likely to follow established procedures and show appropriate skepticism about the most extreme claims made by accusers. Local priests and ministers with minimal formal training were often more susceptible to popular superstitions and more willing to accept almost any evidence of supernatural activity as valid. Medical knowledge, or the tragic lack thereof, played crucial roles in generating and sustaining witch accusations throughout the persecution period. Medieval physicians had extremely limited understanding of mental illness, epilepsy, ergot poisoning, and other conditions that could produce symptoms easily attributed to supernatural causes by communities seeking explanations for inexplicable phenomena. When children experienced seizures, adults suffered hallucinations, or entire communities fell victim to mysterious illnesses, witchcraft provided convenient explanations that seemed to make perfect sense within existing worldviews. The random nature of disease transmission suggested supernatural intervention to people who lacked scientific understanding of contagion, immunity, and other factors that determined why some individuals survived, while others perished during epidemic outbreaks. The intersection of folk medicine and witchcraft accusations created particular dangers for women who served their communities as healers, midwives, and herbalists. These women possessed knowledge about medicinal plants, childbirth procedures, and traditional remedies that could easily be reinterpreted as evidence of supernatural knowledge obtained through diabolic pacts, rather than natural learning and experience. Successful healings could be attributed to beneficial magic that might later be revealed as diabolic in origin, while failed treatments became evidence of malevolent witchcraft directed against specific victims. The very knowledge that made these women valuable to their communities also made them vulnerable to accusations when medical outcomes didn't meet expectations or when political circumstances made scapegoats necessary. Pregnancy and childbirth created especially dangerous situations for both mothers and the midwives who attended them when complications arose or outcomes proved tragic. Infant mortality rates were extraordinarily high throughout medieval Europe, and stillbirths, birth defects, or maternal deaths during delivery were often attributed to supernatural interference rather than natural causes that medical science couldn't yet understand or prevent. Midwives who attended difficult births could find themselves accused of witchcraft if outcomes were poor, creating terrible ironies where the women most dedicated to helping their communities became targets for persecution precisely because of their involvement in life's most vulnerable moments. The specialized knowledge required for successful midwifery could be interpreted as evidence of supernatural assistance rather than natural skill and experience. The phenomenon of epidemic diseases created especially fertile ground for witch accusations, as communities desperately sought explanations for catastrophes that struck seemingly at random. When plague, typhus, smallpox, or other contagious diseases swept through regions, people needed someone to blame for the seemingly arbitrary patterns of death and survival that characterize these outbreaks. The symptoms of ergot poisoning, caused by consuming grain infected with a hallucinogenic fungus, may have contributed to some of the most dramatic witch accusation episodes recorded in historical documents. Ergot could cause convulsions, hallucinations, and bizarre behavior that medieval people interpreted as evidence of demonic possession or supernatural attack, rather than natural poisoning from contaminated food supplies. Entire communities consuming ergot-contaminated grain could experience mass hallucinations that seemed to confirm the reality of witches and their malevolent activities. These collective experiences created powerful evidence for supernatural threats that convinced even skeptical observers that diabolic forces were indeed operating within their communities, justifying aggressive responses that might otherwise have seemed excessive or unwarranted. The targeting patterns that emerged during witch persecution campaigns reveal disturbing consistencies about which individuals and groups were most vulnerable to accusations across different regions and time periods. Women comprised roughly 80% of those accused and executed for witchcraft, with older women being disproportionately represented among the victims of systematic persecution campaigns. But the gender bias wasn't random or accidental. It reflected deeply embedded cultural beliefs about women's supposed spiritual weakness, their alleged susceptibility to demonic influence, and their perceived threats to male-dominated social structures. Women who lived independently, who possessed property or specialized knowledge, or who challenged conventional expectations about feminine behavior, were particularly likely to attract accusations during periods of community stress. Widows represented especially vulnerable populations because they often inherited property from deceased husbands while lacking male protection against accusations or legal challenges. Their independence made them suspect in societies that expected women to remain under male authority throughout their lives, while their assets provided economic incentives for accusations that could result in property confiscation and redistribution. Unmarried women over a certain age also faced elevated risks, particularly if they lived alone or maintained themselves through activities that required specialized knowledge. Herbalists, healers, midwives, and other women who possessed skills that could be interpreted as supernatural fell into this category, as did women who simply failed to conform to expected patterns of marriage and motherhood. The economic dimensions of targeting reveal how witch accusations functioned as mechanisms for property redistribution and social control, rather than genuine attempts to eliminate supernatural threats. Wealthy widows, successful female merchants, and other women who had accumulated significant assets were more likely to face accusations than poor women who possessed nothing worth confiscating. The social isolation that made certain individuals vulnerable to witch accusations was often itself a product of economic or social conflicts that predated the supernatural charges. Women who had disputed property boundaries, challenged inheritance decisions, or competed successfully with male-dominated enterprises might find themselves gradually ostracized by communities that later proved eager to believe witchcraft accusations against them. The age patterns among witch trial victims reflect medieval beliefs about the relationship between aging and supernatural corruption, particularly in women. The cessation of menstruation was thought to alter women's spiritual nature in ways that made them more susceptible to demonic influence, while the accumulated disappointments and resentments of long lives supposedly provided motivations for seeking supernatural revenge against more fortunate neighbours. Children played complex and often tragic roles in witch persecution campaigns, serving simultaneously as accusers, witnesses, and sometimes victims of the systematic violence that consumed their communities. The special weight given to children's testimony reflected beliefs about their spiritual purity and inability to lie convincingly about supernatural matters, but it also created opportunities for manipulation by adults who recognized the power of youthful accusations. The phenomenon of child accusers appears repeatedly in documented witch trials across Europe and colonial America. Groups of children would simultaneously begin experiencing fits, claiming to see specters of local women tormenting them, and naming specific individuals as their supernatural persecutors. These episodes often spread like contagious hysteria, with symptoms and accusations jumping from child to child until entire communities became convinced they were under coordinated supernatural attack. The Salem witch trials provide the most famous example of child accusations spiraling completely out of control, but similar patterns appeared throughout European witch hunting campaigns. Once children began making accusations, adults felt compelled to take them seriously, leading to investigations that inevitably uncovered more evidence of witchcraft through the very process of looking for supernatural threats. The coaching of child witnesses, whether conscious or unconscious, played significant roles in many witch trials. Leading questions, repeated suggestions, and the intense attention that came with being at the center of supernatural investigations could easily influence young minds to produce testimony that adults wanted to hear. The children themselves often genuinely believed their own accounts, making their testimony seem authentic and convincing to medieval juries. The seasonal patterns of witch accusations reveal how closely these persecutions were tied to community stress cycles and agricultural rhythms that governed medieval life. Accusations typically peaked during times of crisis, such as failed harvests, severe weather, disease outbreaks, or other events that threatened community survival and created desperate needs for explanations and scapegoats. After walking through the horrors of medieval witch persecution, examining the impossible tests and systematic torture that claimed tens of thousands of lives, the answer to our question becomes tragically clear. You couldn't have survived a witch trial because the system wasn't designed for survival. It was designed for destruction. The tests were rigged, the confessions were forced, and innocence was literally impossible to prove. Your best hope wasn't proving you weren't a witch. It was never being accused in the first place. But once those whispers started, once your name was spoken with suspicion, the machinery of persecution ground forward with relentless efficiency. The witch trials remind us that civilization is fragile, that fear can transform neighbors into executioners, and that the vulnerable will always pay the highest price when communities abandon justice for predetermined outcomes. The next time you see fear driving accusations against the defenseless, remember the swimming ponds and burning stakes of medieval Europe. History doesn't repeat, but it certainly rhymes. Could you have survived? Probably not. But more importantly, would you have the courage to ensure it never happens again?